Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. I'm Randy Wright, and I'll be your captain on this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. Folks, this will be the final boarding call, so if you please, claim your seats, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show while I go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist, as there really is a lot of news and information to get to before I may fully indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, here we are. We are in the week of Thanksgiving, one of the oldest holidays for the United States of America, and I think it's time, especially after we have had such a heated, contentious, and personalized election cycle, that we take a moment back to reflect upon what the true meaning of the Thanksgiving holiday is. Now, of course, the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists are going to attempt to say that Thanksgiving is a holiday of appropriation and is too linked to religion to be of any good in a fast-paced modern society like we live in today. But nothing really could be further from the truth. Thanksgiving goes to the natural law tenets that help underpin our entire federalist system, as well as our shared United States Constitution, and it is a long-standing attribute and characteristic of these United States of America, and it really will always have that attribute to it. But the special snowflakes, as I'm liking to call them here, are the ones that just go out and try and find everything that is wrong with American society, try to lay blame and point their fingers at America first, because that is their modus operandi. It is what they have been pushing for the past century and a half now, folks, and they have incrementally been moving to transform the United States. But before we delve any deeper into this, what exactly do we mean by Thanksgiving? Well, to give Thanksgiving in a religious connotation or context is to say that you are humbling yourself, basically prostrating yourself before God, thanking Him for the blessings and the bountiful gifts that you have received during the year. And it has a basis in the agrarian type of culture that dominated before the Industrial Revolution got into full swing. But setting aside time to give thanks for one's blessings, along with holding feasts to celebrate a harvest, are both practices that long predate the European settlement of North America. James Baker, a historian, has said that debates over where any first Thanksgiving took place on modern American territory are a tempest in a bean pot. Now, what he meant by that is that each of the several colonies that were established had their own unique day of giving thanks for being able to survive such a tumultuous and dangerous journey. Back in the 17th and 18th centuries, intercontinental travel was exceedingly dangerous. You had just sail-powered sloop-type ships that were inherently unstable. You had long periods of travel with poor food supplies, and therefore, if you survived the transatlantic crossing, you were a very fortunate soul. And then once you did survive the transatlantic crossing, you were fortunate if you landed anywhere near where you had originally intended to land, and then you had to deal with the hostilities of the land, whether it be natives that were hostile, diseases that you had never been exposed to before, and therefore had no immunity or no immune system preparations for, and also the crops and animal husbandry that was going on in those early, what would become American settlements, were not really suited for the type of climate that existed in New England and on the eastern seaboard at that time. So it was a very arduous thing, and they were risking life and limb, and therefore, being a very religious time as it was, they thought it very important to give Thanksgiving for the fact that they managed to avoid having famine and that they were able to survive the year, because the first ever attempted colony in what would become the United States, the colony of Roanoke, Virginia, it was an abject failure because they didn't have the proper supplies, they didn't have the proper equipment, and their health was poor from a turbulent transatlantic crossing. And so it wasn't until 1609, with the settlement of Jamestown, that we first see a successful colony in the New World that is British take foot and actually begin to succeed. And what we see is, with respect to the way that the historical revisionists who infest our ivory towers of academia from coast to coast and border to border, they're trying to say that it was cultural appropriation with how they treated the Indians, or what they call Native Americans, using that cancerous doctrine of political correctness, and they try and say that this was just imperialism of the worst sort. But that is, again, attempting to apply modern social mores and modern sensibilities onto a people that lived centuries ago. And it's really not fair. And the reason I say that is they didn't have the same kinds of technology we do. They did not have the Enlightenment era quite in full swing yet, and therefore the ideals that would eventually become the bedrock foundations of the United States were just, they were roughly understood. They were still being, in the process of being developed, and therefore it really is intellectually disingenuous to try and attach our modern outlook onto a people that lived so long ago. And it really is to take away from the adversities and the hurdles and the obstacles these people faced. They were starting a new life, and they had no idea whether it would be successful. They were taking a leap of faith, and that is why the Thanksgiving aspect of having a day to celebrate the harvest and to give thanks unto the God of nature for their survival, that was considered an intricate part of how they would survive. It was something that they thought intimately would help bring them success in their ventures on this alien land to them. And so we have to keep all of that in mind. So we all know from how, when we were children, we were taught about the Indians and the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock Plantation, or Plymouth Plantation. That is a meal that took place in 1621. And yes, a lot of what is adopted by the popular psyche in the United States today, it wasn't exactly how things happened, but we have to realize that it was the settlers holding a harvest feast after a successful growing season, which they weren't entirely sure they were going to have. Remember that the failure of Roanoke was still fresh on the settlers' minds, and therefore they were concerned that this is something that might happen to them. The failing of Roanoke could certainly happen again, and therefore just being able to sustain themselves was a major accomplishment, particularly given that their tools weren't well suited for the type of land and soil that was in the New England area. Also, keeping in mind that their wheat and other types of crops were not well acclimated for the type of climate that was in that region as well. And so it was a major undertaking. It was a major success, and one that was certainly not guaranteed that they were able to have that meal. And so it was a festival. And there's the story of Squano, the Pawtec native who resided in the Wampanoag tribe, and he taught them how to catch eel, grow corn, and served as an interpreter for them. So, yes, there was a cultural exchange that occurred. And so you can see, going back to the earliest days of what would become the United States of America, we did have a melting pot. And so it really goes against some of the narratives that we've heard with respect to the so-called alternative or alt-right, who are trying to define nationalism in the United States based on tribalism. No, tribalism was what was existing within the Amero-Indians at that time, not so much with the Europeans, because national identities had already developed based on nation states. You see, that's the whole thing. Nation states, not dynastic entities or dynastic tribes. So already we see that mercantilism was beginning to fade away, capitalism was beginning to develop, and the future groundwork for what would become the United States of America was already put in place. And so it was the beginning of the journey that would allow us to become the robust and free nation that we are today. It would certainly take a long time, but we know that those early elements were there. And we have primary sources that talk about that. We have William Bradford's account of Plymouth Plantation, in which he said they began now to gather in the small harvest they had, and to fit up their houses and dwellings against winter, being all well recovered in health and strength, and had all things in good plenty. For as some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took good store, of which every family had their portion. All the summer there was no want, and now began to come the store of fowl, as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they can be used, but afterward decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl there was a great store of wild turkeys, which is where we get our traditional Thanksgiving meal, of which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck a meal a week to a person, or now since harvest, Indian corn and proportion, which made many afterwards write so largely of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not feigned but true reports. So you see, what was going on there was that the conditions were such that the English back in England were thinking of the failures of Roanoke. They were surprised that there could be bounty. They were surprised that there could be plenty. And certainly the Plymouth colonists were not taking this for granted. This is why they had the feast, to give thanks to their Maker. And it's that sort of understanding that your life, your liberty, your pursuit of happiness are endowed to you by God that is what continued with respect to the forging of the American identity. That is the American experience personified, because we see that that continues with our founding fathers as they went about the difficult task of forging a new nation based on a philosophy in the type and form that had never been attempted before in the course of human events. That is an incredible thing to realize. It's an incredible aspect of who we are, both as a nation and as a people, and it had its roots back in these early celebrations in which the colonists were giving thanks to their Maker, or whom they perceived to be their Maker. And we know that Thanksgiving had been celebrated in Massachusetts Bay Colony for the first time in 1630, and frequently thereafter until about 1680, when it became an annual festival in that colony. Thanksgiving was celebrated in Connecticut as early as 1639 and annually after 1647, except in 1675. The colonists of New Netherland appointed a day for giving thanks in 1644 and occasionally thereafter. So already it was becoming a well established tradition before we even had the first embers of the revolutionary spirit, the spirit of independence, forming in what would become the United States of America. So it was a critical aspect of what these nations or colonies were attempting to achieve. And they were seeking to expand. They were seeking to find a better life, to make their life more comfortable, to be able to thrive, flourish, and succeed. And that's something that is shared across the board with the human condition. And that is why I think Thanksgiving should have far-reaching impacts and should be considered a quintessentially American holiday as it always was. But we see, with respect to the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists who are dyed-in-the-wool members of the Blame America First crowd, they want to try and proclaim that this was an illegitimate history, appropriation or stealing or destroying, basically creating a path that was wrought with death, decay, and devastation. But again, nothing could be further from the truth. What was happening at that time was the celebration and the humbling of themselves in order to stand up for their rights and to recognize just how bountiful the gifts they had received truly, really were, and how significant that was. They were a very humble people, but we as a nation and as a people, as we have gone further along in our relatively brief yet illustrious history, have forgotten so much of this because it's no longer taught in our institutions of education from coast to coast and border to border. It's now taught that these people were basically just religious renegades, fanatics of the worst sort that were just looking out for their own self-interest, which, yes, it's true. Self-preservation was one of the major motivational and driving forces of the Puritan settlers of the New World. They were seeking to escape religious persecution that existed in England with the establishment of the Church of England, and that has its origins back about 100 years or more before this period with Henry VIII and the dissolution of Catholic England. And so the Puritans wanted to go a step further. They wanted to become more Calvinist than what was happening in Europe at that time, and that means very austere, more austere than what was in England. And the King of England at that time was thought to be very friendly to the Catholics because it was the Stuart lineage in which there were what they called recalcitrant Catholics within the royal family. And so these Puritans were seeking to escape the just awful sorts of religious persecution that existed, particularly after the English Civil War. And that's kind of something that we don't discuss that much anymore. We just want to say that they were religious fanatics. But compared to what everyone else was going through at that time, and compared to the way that the European powers were still fighting each other and warring with each other, they were not all that radical. So why is it that they would go out on a limb to basically give thanks to their maker for this? It's because they realized that there was something greater in the mix, that they themselves were basically taking a leap of faith to carve out a new and better life for themselves in this new world. And a lot of them died. A lot of them died on the trip over. A lot of the trips over were unsuccessful. After all, when the Mayflower had set out, it was supposed to be joined by its sister ship, the Speedwell, but the Speedwell was so old, rickety, and leaky, it had to return to port back in England. So they were already, without half of their manpower. Their strength was cut or reduced by half from the very outset. So they felt very fortunate to have survived. They felt very fortunate to have even been able to sustain themselves, particularly when they weren't all that familiar with the farming techniques that were necessary to help them get through the brutal winter months. And yes, in New England at that time, the winters were exceedingly brutal. And so we have to keep that aspect of it in mind when we look back on those original Thanksgiving celebrations, and we can draw connotations to it and compare it to what we are encountering in modern society. For starters, we are so fortunate to have the longest contiguous or uninterrupted running constitutional document in the entire course of human events. Of course, I'm speaking of our shared United States Constitution. We are so fortunate to be blessed with the fundamental and inalienable God-given rights that each and every one of us can enjoy and exercise on a daily basis without the fear of governmental repercussions, and recriminations. There are very few people on the face of the earth who can enjoy that soundly and regularly and as consistently as we have here in these United States of America. And so that is a quintessential aspect of who we are. And so this day that has its origins in the earliest colonial period of what would become the United States is basically a celebration of the fact that we survived and that we could become the robust nation and people that we are today. And it was also during that time that we started forging our separate identity. Because again, as I had mentioned just a little bit earlier, the travel of that time was exceedingly dangerous, and it was time-consuming and expensive, and therefore the king or crown in England and Parliament in England really could not respond appropriately or timely, or basically in a timely fashion, to what the colonists needed immediately on the ground. So a new, separate, unique, and independent identity began to form among the settlers who were forging a new life for themselves in the New World. And their idea of being humble and being grateful for the opportunities that they did have and for the ability to do what they did, that speaks volumes about the national heritage, character, spirit, but above all, identity of we the people of these United States of America. It goes to the very heart of our identity. And of course, it makes sense that the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists, the historical revisionists, the rank and file of the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media would want to attack this, much as they do with Columbus Day or the National Day of Prayer. They do that because they don't want the body politique of this republic of ours to recall what is the quintessential aspects of who we are. They want us to basically be ashamed of where we came from. They want to be able to lampoon those people who literally took a leap of faith and gave birth to a nation forged on the ideals of liberty and the natural law tenets which are by their nature immutable, meaning just as applicable today as they were 235 years ago, as God willing they will be 235 years from today. All of that was conceived in these various celebrations that were occurring in the English settlements in the New World. Because these colonists were, for lack of a better term, actually pioneers. They were forging a new identity. They were forging a new nation, though they did not know it at the time. And because of that, we have that sort of characteristic that I've oftentimes reiterated on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer. And what I'm speaking to, folks, is self responsibility and self accountability working in tandem to give us self determination. Back then, when the colonists had landed, most people in Europe viewed sovereignty as the king. They saw themselves as subjects or subjected to the absolute anointed by God rule of the king. That's what was known as the divine rights of kings. That started to fade in the New World because it had already started to fade in England with the first codification of the natural law tenets, with the baronage of England in the summer of 1215 at the field of Runnymede, forcing King John of Robin Hood fame to sign the Magna Carta, basically saying that there was a law of the land. Then, with the provisions of Oxford under Henry III, we saw more changes, more limitations on the power of the king, although it was certainly ignored by Edward Longshanks, King Edward I. But that sort of development of the rights of English citizens, which culminated in the works of John Locke, from whom Thomas Jefferson had gotten those poetic words that he put down in the Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain fundamental and unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's John Locke. That's a continuation of those natural law tenets that were first devised in Magna Carta, then expanded in the provisions of Oxford, and then further expanded by English statutory law. But when I say that sovereignty itself was changing, in England it had already changed to being a king and parliament. But by the time you get to the colonists, because of the dangers of travel, the time consumption that it took to travel, the difficulty of communication, they started to see themselves as separate. Now, they still viewed themselves as English, but they didn't think that those in the mother country were fully cognizant or aware of the things that they were encountering, and of course they weren't. This was a new sort of untamed wilderness. It was a frontier. That was the beginning of the frontier mentality that would become a dominant characteristic of America's developmental history. And we still have aspects of that frontier mindset, even though the frontier has but vanished. And what we were seeking to achieve was a better future for ourselves and for our progeny. And so that mindset was firmly entrenched and well in place at the time that the founding fathers began to take a step back and proclaim, look, what they are doing is they are failing to represent us. They're ignoring our needs as English citizens, and the king is acting like a tyrant. The whole notion of no taxation without representation has its basis in this time. And again, the kings of England didn't really pay much attention to the chartered colonies that had been established in the New World, because they were, first of all, dealing with the aftermath of the English Civil War. They were also, very aware of the fact that Roanoke had failed, and so these colonies, yes, they were successful at that time. They could be a source of revenue for the mercantilist type system that they had, meaning limited resources, but they were too distant or too remote to really try to exert taxes over. And of course, this notion would begin to change with the 7 Years' War, as it was known in Europe, or the French and Indian War, as it was known here in what would become the United States. The British had to expend exorbitant amounts of money to defend the colonial interests in New England against British forces or not British, but French forces from Canada and from other areas who had made alliances with some of the hostile Indian tribes, Amero Indian tribes that were in the area. And so they thought, well, who better to pay for this than the colonists, whom were directly benefiting from the massive amounts of military debt that England had racked up in defending their colonial interests. But for the colonists, this really was not a great development because they had never been taxed before. Their income system, their entire economy was dependent upon being mostly able to freely barter, and they were a very well-read people. And when you had the intolerable acts go into place, that began to change the whole dynamic. And so we see that was a critical aspect of what started the development of our mindset. And I'll tie that into Thanksgiving and the Thanksgiving holiday even more so in the next segment. In the previous segment or section, we covered the very early beginnings of the Thanksgiving holiday and explained a little bit of how that ties into the modern American perception of ourselves, both as a nation and as a people. But I now want to tie it into the revolutionary spirit. And when I speak of the revolutionary spirit, I'm talking about the natural law tenets that form the cornerstone of our nation, our culture, and our society. And we know that one of the things that our founding fathers had been against was this whole notion of virtual representation, where they were allegedly being represented by the centralized parliament in London back in the mother country of Great Britain. But that wasn't good enough for the colonists due to the vast ocean that separated the mother country and the colonies, which really did leave them in a precarious position if they had to respond to something or they needed a swift or immediate legal action. That's why we saw the development of the Houses of Burgesses as well as the other various legislative assemblies that were created in the 13 colonies and their own independent magistrate and courts. And so that was also something that helped spear front or was the vanguard of the establishment of this separate, unique, and independent identity that really was separate and apart from Great Britain. However, during the American Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress had appointed one or more Thanksgiving days each year, each time recommending to the executives of the various states the observance of these days within their own jurisdiction. So what we see is in this time, when they were basically making a proclamation for a Thanksgiving holiday, they were still respecting the quasi-sovereign status of the several states. And that speaks to the what would develop to be the tenets of federalism, that is, the proper relationship with respect to the exercising of power, both by the central government and by the governments of the several states. And what we have reiterated oft times on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, is the fact that because the state governments predated the Constitution or the establishment of the centralized or federal government, and because they are closer to the people, thereby allowing the people to exert or exercise more power, influence, and control over the various state governments, which are also, again, better able to address localized problems, it made sense that the federal government was one that was meant to be expressly limited, that it would have to trace all of its power and authority to be legitimate to a specific power, which was enumerated unto it by the clear and concise language contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution. That is something that was already developing at that time because of these legislative assemblies and magistrate courts and whatnot that I had just mentioned. And so there was a unique development here. But the first national proclamation of Thanksgiving was given by the Continental Congress back in 1777, right after the start of the American Revolution. It had started back in late 1775 with Lexington and Concord. And of course, on July 4th of 1776, Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence, which has the hallmarks of the natural law tenets that form the bedrock foundation of not only the Constitution, but also the constitutionally endowed Federalist representative Republican form of government that we know and love to today. The original proclamation was given at the temporary location of York, Pennsylvania, due to the British occupation of the national capital of Philadelphia. And it was Sam Adams who created this first draft. And recall that we have oftentimes reiterated the name of Sam Adams on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, as the founding father who basically proclaimed that in order for our republic to be a thriving and free republic, the people must be virtuous. And we can see from this draft kind of exactly the mindset that Sam Adams had, where he was driving and deriving his inspiration for this within this draft. So I'm going to read you the final version that included most of what Sam Adams had included in that original draft. And it says, "For as much as it is the indispensable duty of all men to adore the superintending providence of Almighty God, to acknowledge with gratitude their obligation to Him for benefits received, and to implore such farther blessings as they stand in need of, and it having pleased Him in His abundant mercy, not only to continue to us the innumerable bounties of His common providence, but also to smile upon us in the prosecution of a just and necessary war for the defense and establishment of our unalienable rights and liberties." Right there, folks, we see the very strain that would be the central fundamental pillar of the Constitution when it would be drafted and ratified some 10 years later. But also to smile upon us in the prosecution of a just and necessary war for the defense and the establishment of our unalienable rights, particularly in that He hath been pleased in so great a measure to prosper the means used for the support of our troops, and to crown our arms with most signal success. It is therefore recommended to the legislative or executive powers of these United States to set apart Thursday, the 18th day of December next, for solemn thanksgiving and praise, that at one time and with one voice the good people may express the grateful feelings of their hearts, and consecrate themselves to the service of their divine benefactor, and that, together with their sincere acknowledgments and offerings, they may join the penitent confession of their manifold sins, whereby they had forfeited every favor, and their humble and earnest supplication that it may please God, through the merits of Jesus Christ, mercifully to forgive and blot them out of remembrance, that it may please Him graciously to afford His blessing on the governments of these states respectively, and prosper the public counsel of the whole, to inspire our commanders both by land and sea, and all under them, with that wisdom and fortitude which may render them fit instruments under the providence of Almighty God, to secure for these United States the greatest of all human blessings, independence and peace. See, independence was actually more important than peace, and I'll explain that a little bit um, that it may please him to prosper the trade and manufactures of the people and the labor of the husbandmen, that our land may yield its increase, to take schools and seminaries of education so necessary for cultivating the principles of true liberty, virtue, and piety under his nurturing hand, and to prosper the means of religion for the promotion and enlargement of that kingdom which consisteth in righteous peace and joy in the Holy Ghost. And it is further recommended that servile labor and such recreation as, though at other times innocent, may be unbecoming the purpose of this appointment, be omitted on so solemn a occasion. Okay, right there, we see the very bedrock beginnings of how our system of polity works. This notion that we have those fundamental and inalienable rights, that they are endowed to us by our Creator, the God of nature himself, and that they are immutable, that they are more important than peace. But here we see an interesting aspect that lays out exactly what the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftist and their allies in the media and in the historical revisionists that infest our institutions of education from coast to coast and border to border comes to mind. You see that they try and teach a revised history in which they revile our founding fathers, whereas we see in this first national proclamation of Thanksgiving that it says that to take schools and seminaries of education so necessary for for cultivating the principles of true liberty, virtue, and piety. In other words, these institutions of education, the ivory towers of academia, were seen as tools to spread the Enlightenment era ideology that was truthfully and honestly guiding and leading our founding fathers in the development of what would become the United States of America as we know and love it. And we see that in this day and age, particularly with things such as Common Core standard education, that the federal government has moved away and has distanced itself and has divorced itself from the original thoughts, philosophies, and ideologies that underpin the very foundations of our cherished representative republic. And it's why my first officer, Jeremy Grapington, and our first Air Marshal, Mr. Nelson Ward, and yours truly, have so oft-times reiterated on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, that if we are stripped and deprived of our fundamental and inalienable God-given rights, then we are left with nothing. That is the same type of mindset. It follows the same flow of logic that was utilized and promoted and advocated by our founding fathers at the inception of this nation, some, in this case, 239 years ago. It shows that the whole notion of our separate, unique, and independent identity had been forged, and that it was based in these immutable principles and laws. And what that tells me above all else is that we are exceedingly fortunate to be the beneficiaries of the greatest birthright or inheritance of any people on the face of God's green earth. And of course, that of which I speak is none other than our shared United States Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land, and is therefore a continuation of this unique identity that began to really form during the summer of 1215 at Runnymede in England. This was the next logical step, the next logical advancement after the principles of Oxford, the whole law that was handed down to weaken the king during the medieval period by Simon de Montfort. This was the next step. This was the next logical step in which they were recognizing we the people as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this burgeoning representative republic of ours. And again, we know that Sam Adams said that in order for the republic to thrive and for the people to remain free and to secure the blessings of liberty, that we had to be a virtuous people, that we had to hold our leaders accountable, and that meant even on issues of morality. That's something that you don't hear discussed by the rank and file of the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media. And the reason you don't hear that is because it stands in stark opposition to this propagandistic narrative and agenda that they have been pushing down our throats at least since the time of William Randolph Hearst and his newspaper conglomerate at the turn of the 20th century. And what the media is hoping to do, and certainly we saw this come to fruition with a lot of those WikiLeaks document dumps that occurred throughout the presidential election cycle, is they want to control the narrative. They want to be able to control who wields the reins of political power in this once thriving and flourishing representative Republican vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours. And therefore, they are willing to do anything. They are willing to do everything to obfuscate the truth so long as it advances and promotes their dark, twisted machinations and ideologies, which truly has no place in an open, honest, but above all, free society like that of these United States of America. And so we see also from this clear, demonstrable evidence that our founding fathers saw Thanksgiving as part of the natural law tenets, part of that same enduring and immutable mindset that led to the creation of the longest contiguous or uninterrupted running constitutional document in the entire course of human events. That is incredible. It speaks volumes about who we are, both as a nation and as a people, and what it is that we sought to achieve going back to the inception of the nation. We also know that George Washington had proclaimed a day of Thanksgiving in December of 1777 as a victory celebration honoring the defeat of the British at the Battle of Saratoga. So already it was being tied into this whole notion of us humbling ourselves before our Creator to give thanks for all that was being allowed to transpire and the fact that our new system of polity could be allowed to develop unfettered. It was beautiful. It speaks to that. It ties into that. And yes, while the popular imagery of the Thanksgiving holiday relates primarily to that first meal at Plymouth Plantation back in 1621, it also speaks deeper to that. It speaks deeper than that in that it ties directly into that spirit of liberty, justice, and a true sense of equality that forms the bedrock foundation of our nation, being those natural law tenets which are by their very nature immutable. And that is something that we should keep in mind. And what's amazing to me is that we still have George Washington's original proclamation to his own troops for Saratoga. And again, that is just such a beautiful thing to see. It speaks volumes as to who we are, both as a nation and as a people. And you see, it's got the stamp up there of the government protecting it. And he took the time to do this. Why? Because it was necessary in his mind for the cause to remain just and for the American people to give thanks for what they had achieved, so that the entire world could see that we were in a just and noble cause that was speaking to a higher power or a higher authority than they themselves. And in fact, one of the things that King George III had done at the end of the Revolution, when hearing that George Washington was stepping down after 2 terms of office, he said, "Then there has been no such Caesar in history, and he is a far better man than I." And yes, it speaks to that. It speaks to how we, as a nation and as a people, were dedicated not to an all expansive government, but rather to one that was strictly limited, one that could not wield plenary power or near absolute power. We had rejected that. It's as Thomas Paine had said in some of his memoirs that a monarchy was the most vile, wicked, and evil system of government ever devised by the hands of men. And of course, that spoke directly to what it was that our founding fathers were hoping to achieve with the establishment of the United States. They wanted a nation that was virtuous, that was based on these immutable natural law tenets, and they wanted to secure the blessings of liberty and the domestic tranquility, not just for their generation, but for posterity. And you find this same mindset, this same approach in the beautiful language that starts off the preamble to our shared United States Constitution. And it's just a mere continuation of the way that they basically lived their lives, the mindset that they had, this virtuous ideal that they were hoping to achieve. Unfortunately, in modern politics, we see that that has been ignored. We have people who claim to be on the right, people like Edmund Kozak, that writes for Laura Ingram's LifeZet page, who said that the Constitution is a mere piece of paper. But what we see from the totality of the circumstances and from the great weight of the primary sources that serve as evidence for what our founding fathers were thinking, how they approached this, because it's certainly not within the realm of living memory anymore, it was, no, this isn't just a mere piece of paper. This is the codification of an ideology, an idea, a more perfect union, but not perfection, because in their sagacity and near infinite wisdom and foresight, our founding fathers fully realized that you cannot achieve perfection in this earthly mortal realm. And therefore, they were willing to try to strive to achieve perfection, but they realized that the process would be ongoing for posterity. Again, that ties itself back into the immutable natural law tenets that form the bedrock foundation of the Constitution and thereby our republic as well. And that's part of the reason why we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, get a little bit miffed when people just willy-nilly, loosey-goosey use the term democracy. Oh, the United States is a democracy, or we're going to fight to preserve democracy. But here's the thing. The United States is not a democracy. A democracy only recognizes the sovereign rights of a majority. Or, as founding father Benjamin Franklin put it, a democracy is 2 wolves and a lamb voting for what to eat for lunch. It's not a good system. A representative republic with democratic-style elections, however, seeks to preserve, protect, and advocate the rights of the sovereign individual, all people. That's why we have the Electoral College. That's why we have delegations. That's why we have the 3 separate branches of government and the tenets of federalism. It is all part of a well-oiled machine designed to protect the rights of we the people. Unfortunately, in recent years, and it certainly for at least the past 50 to 60 plus years, the government has been moving away from that. The government has been distancing and divorcing itself from that, and that is why you start to see a lot of these problems that have become recurrent problems in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours. And folks, there's really no way around that. There's no way to sugarcoat that. There's no way to candy coat that. It is a problem that we are encountering. And again, it shows us that it has distanced itself from what our founding fathers found so crucial with those proclamations that they had. Remember, they said that it needs to be for the blessings of independence above peace, but independence and peace. Sam Adams called those the greatest of all human blessings. And what he meant by that was that their goals would achieve that. And through the codification and ratification of our shared United States Constitution, which, pursuant to Article 6, Clause 2, what is known in common parlance as the Supremacy Clause, is the supreme law of the land. Again, it shows that we've gone step by step by step by step to secure ultimate liberty, that we were striving to be a better society. So no, they did not achieve perfection at that time. They didn't even consider that they had achieved perfection. But they put forth their best efforts. And in so doing, and against all the odds, they created the most stable, secure, free, open, and honest government that this world has ever seen. And yet, we know that there are those nefarious elements within modern American society that are hell-bent on destroying all of it, to replace it with a system such as socialism or communism or what have you, that has nothing but a well-established track record in the annals of history of abject failure. That's what they want to turn to. Why? Because it comes down to power, manipulation, and control. That is where the corruption comes from. That is where the multitude of problems that we're facing, and that seem to only be growing worse, come from. That's why it's so important that as we head into this Thanksgiving Thursday, that we remember and reflect upon exactly what it was that that day of days was meant to represent. We have to be able to think about things in an overarching picture, considering the totality of the circumstances to ensure that we remain a robust but above all virtuous republic. And that requires that we be proactive. Now, there are many who would say that that's too difficult, that we shouldn't try and do that, that we don't have the time to do that, and that the Constitution is some quaint, antiquated document from centuries ago. But again, when you keep in mind the fact that the natural law tenets that form the foundation of our country are immutable by their nature, just as applicable today as they were back then, as they will be, God willing, 200 plus years from now. That means that the document cannot be quaint and it cannot be antiquated. It also means that the Constitution cannot be a living document. You see, that too is part of the revisionism that has started to take a hold in our institutions of higher learning from coast to coast and border to border. And it is a dangerous development. Because while it may seem that this is just playing semantics, it's not. The semantics that are being played are those things where they try and change it. This whole ridiculous notion of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to it, being nothing but negative rights. They do that to make it sound bad. They do that to make it sound as though it's obstructionist or exclusionary, when in fact it's inclusionary and welcoming, and is a shield against a rogue, tyrannical, but ultimately illegitimate federal government that is not operating to serve the people. Recall again that when you look at the opening lines to the preamble to the Constitution, it says, "We the people." That says who it was that congregated together to create this nation. And the Constitution is a contract to which the people are a party and their government is a party. And when the government divorces itself and distances itself from the clear and concise language contained within the four corners of the Constitution, it is thereby in breach of contract. And therefore, that's why you find in the First Amendment that it's not just freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and free exercise of religion, it's also the right of the people to petition their government for a redress of grievances. And if the government fails to do that, then we see that they have abused the power that was delegated to them, and they are no longer acting with the authority of power. That is the beauty of the system. It is what they don't want you to know, because that really empowers you in your capacity as one of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty of this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours. So the historical revisionists and the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists and the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media want you to be downtrodden. Keep that in mind. All demonstrates that the whole application of our identity has not changed over the years. And again, that is all due to the immutable natural law tenets that form the bedrock foundation of our Constitution and our constitutionally endowed federalist representative republic. So we then move to how Thanksgiving was basically treated during the first 30 years of nationhood, after we had secured our independence from Great Britain and had literally started forging our own identity for the rest of the world to see. And the Articles of Confederation, which predated the Constitution and had basically run from the period of 1774 until the final ratification of the Constitution in 1789, had issued several national days of prayer, humiliation, and what they meant by humiliation here was basically humbling oneself before one's creator, the God of nature, and thanksgiving. This was a practice that had been continued by President Washington and Adams under the Constitution, and we know that its modern manifestation is with the observances of Thanksgiving and the National Day of Prayer. And that continues to this very day, much to the chagrin of the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists who would want to do anything in their power to remove any type of glorification of the Almighty from our system of polity. Because again, that makes it easier for them to go forth and proclaim that the rights of the people don't come from a higher power than humanity itself, but are endowed to them by the government, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. Because if the government is the one that endowed you with your natural rights, with those fundamental and inalienable rights, then they could take it away at any point. But that is not the conclusion that our founding father, George Mason, had reached when he was called upon to help draft the Declaration of the State of Rights, or the Declaration of Rights for the state of Virginia. That became the quintessential building block for what would become the Bill of Rights, or first 10 amendments to our shared United States Constitution. And that is something that is still being fought over to this day. Think back to just recently during this 2016 election cycle, how so many of those Democrats had congregated on the House of Representatives floor, the chamber of the floor of the House of Representatives, to basically protest the fundamental and inalienable God-given right of every decent, hard-working, red-blooded American citizen to keep and bear firearms. It was all part of that no buy, no fly, and if you dare mention due process, we cry nonsense that was going on. And you see, what it comes down to is they are trying to create an oligarchy. They follow more of a Hamiltonian approach to government, which is to say that a very structured elite should be able to wield the reins of power and no one else. But when you look at the natural law tenets that form the bedrock foundation of the entire country, you have to think back to the poetic words of Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence when he said that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain fundamental and unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which has been extrapolated to mean property. So, again, so many of those natural law tenets are being alienated when you wish to strip and deprive decent, hardworking, law-abiding, red-blooded American citizens of their fundamental and inalienable rights. And you cannot do so without due process under the law. The Fifth Amendment says that, and the 14th Amendment says that. So it is doubly important, yet we see that those political powers that be, those particularly on the Democrat side, that currently wield the reins of political power in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours, are operating in such a rogue, tyrannical, and ultimately illegitimate fashion because they don't want us to have the power. You see, if you get placed on that no-fly list, there is no due process there. They are essentially not giving you notice and a hearing or the opportunity to face your accuser. So already they're violating the Second, they're violating the Fourth and Fifth and Sixth and Eighth and 14th Amendments. That tells you right there that our founding fathers, in their sagacity and near infinite wisdom and foresight, foresaw that the government might and most probably would start to become rogue, tyrannical, and ultimately illegitimate, as we have seen that to be the case. It has come to fruition. They are standing in a position that is diametrically opposed not just to the popular sovereigns, but to those immutable natural law tenets that form our nation. And that is the way that it needs to be addressed. That is the way it needs to be discussed. But of course, the rank and file of the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media aren't going to do that, because it would basically take the wind out of their sails for their propagandistic narrative and agenda. And as we have so oft times reiterated on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, these nefarious elements are trying to fundamentally and irreparably transform the United States away from being a constitutionally endowed representative republic that is federalist into some stupid socialist dystopia that truly has no place in an open, honest, but above all free society like that of the United States of America. That is insufferable, that is intolerable, and it is unacceptable. But again, it requires that we delve more deeply into our souls and into our identity, both as a nation and as a people, to see what it is that matters to us. And unfortunately, that is not being taught and not being discussed. And again, it's kind of how Thanksgiving has transformed into this solemn occasion in which we were very thankful for the bountiful gifts that we have received throughout the year, to it just mainly being a meal and celebrating football. But I want to go back to the Confederation Congress with its National Day of Prayer and Thanksgiving. Here is their actual proclamation by the United States in Congress assembled proclamation. It being the indispensable duty of all nations, not only to offer up their supplications to Almighty God, the giver of all good, for his gracious assistance in a time of distress, but also in a solemn and public manner, to give him praise for his goodness in general, and especially for great and signal interpositions of his providence in their behalf. There you see a little bit of the continuation of the language of Sam Adams, who said that we had to be a virtuous republic. Therefore, the United States in Congress assembled, taking into their consideration the many instances of divine goodness to these states in the course of the important conflict in which they have been so long engaged, in other words, the struggle for independence, the present happy and promising state of public affairs, and the events of the war in the course of the year now drawing to a close, particularly the harmony of the public councils, which is so necessary to the success of the public cause, meaning that the government must seek guidance from the people and must listen to the people, the perfect union and good understanding which has hitherto subsisted between them and their allies, that the United States must maintain good standing relations with their allies, notwithstanding the artful and unwearied attempts of the common enemy to divide them, a willingness to stand up to all enemies, whether they be foreign or domestic, the success of the arms of the United States and those of their allies, and the acknowledgment of their independence by another European power whose friendship and commerce must be of great and lasting advantage to these states, do hereby recommend it to the inhabitants of these states in general to observe and request the several states to interpose their authority in appointing and commanding the observation of Thursday, the 28th day of November next, as a day of solemn thanksgiving to God for all his mercies. Now, before I continue, you see their request, not a demand. We see that in the modern application of federal power, it's more of a demand. It's more of trying to force the states into action as opposed to respecting their authority. And that is part of the problem that we face. That is why there is this wide litany and range of significant overarching problems that continues to plague, ail, and afflict this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours. But it goes on. It continues. It says, and they do further recommend to all ranks to testify their gratitude to God for his goodness by a cheerful ordinance to his laws, and by promoting, each in his station, and by his influence, the practice of true and undefiled religion, which is the great foundation of public prosperity and national happiness. In other words, follow the natural law tenets. Those natural law tenets that are an immutable, unshakable, and foundational aspect of these United States of America. This was done in Congress at Philadelphia on October 11th, 1782. Okay? That was right around the time that they were starting to see that the Articles of Confederation weren't working. And it was in 1787 that they continued to seek a more perfect union, and that is when they started drafting our shared Constitution. We then see that on Thursday, September 24th, 1789, the first House of Representatives voted to recommend the First Amendment of the newly drafted Constitution to the states for ratification, and that on the following day, Congressman Elias Boudinot from New Jersey proposed that the House and Senate jointly request of President Washington to proclaim a day of thanksgiving for the many signal favors of Almighty God. And Boudinot said that he could not think of letting the session pass over without offering an opportunity to all the citizens of the United States of joining with one voice in returning to Almighty God their sincere thanks for the many blessings he had poured down upon them. In other words, they realized that the sum of the nation, or the whole of the nation, was greater than the mere sum of its parts. That providence had divinely inspired the drafting and ultimate ratification of the United States Constitution. And at that point, you see, it's also with the Bill of Rights, or the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. But in particular, it was to the First Amendment: freedom of religion, free exercise of religion, freedom of expression, and the right of the people to petition their government for a redress of grievances. Again, it all ties into the way that our founding fathers naturally looked at the course and development of this nation as resting with the people. We, the people, own the government. We, the people, own the Constitution. It belongs to us, not to the politicians, except in their capacity as sovereign citizens, and not to the government itself. And so that is really something we should be thankful for. That is something that is holistically unique to the United States. That is why we have the longest contiguous or uninterrupted running constitutional document in the entire course of human events. And it speaks volumes about how our founding fathers believed that power should be wielded or exercised, and just to what the proper scope and application of governmental authority was. And again, as we look at the recent current events and developments that are burgeoning with respect to what's happening in the arena of American politics, we see that we are so vastly distanced and divorced from these original tenets that it's hardly recognizable. If you tried to do this today, you would have special snowflakes like those who want to protest Thomas Jefferson at the University of Virginia, who would say that this is just racist drivel. They'd say it's hateful. Why? Because ultimately, deep down in their heart of hearts and in their souls, they are pushing a narrative that is based on the twin cancerous doctrines that we have declared war upon here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, those of moral relativism and political correctness. It's all designed to create cultural Marxism. And so they are the ones that go forth and try and proclaim that Thanksgiving is but a racist holiday based in imperialism and the appropriation of other cultures, and that it's hateful, and that it's stealing. And of course, nothing, absolutely nothing, could be further from the truth. It is just their diatribe to try and tear this nation apart at the seams, and that is what they have been dedicated to for nearly a century and a half, if not over a century and a half now, folks. We see that it was not until October 6, 1941, however, that both houses of the U.S. Congress passed a joint resolution fixing the traditional last Thursday date for the holiday beginning in 1942. However, in December of 41, right after the Pearl Harbor attacks, the Senate passed an amendment to the resolution that split the difference by requiring that Thanksgiving be observed annually on the fourth Thursday of November, which was usually the last Thursday, and sometimes 2 years out of 7, on average, the next to last. The amendment also passed the House, and on December 26, 1941, the day after Christmas, President Roosevelt had signed this bill for the first time, making the date of Thanksgiving a matter of federal law and fixing the day as the fourth Thursday of November. Now, what that tells me is we know that FDR was a frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist, leftist, who believed in consolidating the power and authority of government in one central branch, or just one aspect of its centralized authority, which, as you could see from the way that the first national proclamations of Thanksgiving were worded and carried out, it was a great departure from the natural law tenets that underpin not only our shared United States Constitution, but also our fundamental and inalienable God-given rights. But what's interesting to note from that is that for several years, some states continued to observe the last Thursday date in years with 5 November Thursdays, the next such year being 1944, from the time that that law was passed, with Texas doing so as late as 1956. That was the states essentially pushing back, saying that what the federal government was doing there was overstepping their authority, was basically disrupting and upsetting the delicate balance that is the tenets of federalism as we find in our shared constitution. It is a critical aspect of who we are, and the way that we do that is we have to know what our past is. And part of that includes fully understanding what the Constitution is. And the Constitution, being the supreme law of the land, tells us how power should be exercised in a lawful and legitimate fashion. And we see even today, like Senator Munchkin, who was one of the lead guys with the no fly, no buy, and if you dare mention due process, we cry bill, to strip and deprive citizens of their fundamental and inalienable God-given right to keep and bear firearms. He said that the Constitution's in our way. This due process thing is in our way. That's right. It is in your way, because it was designed to prohibit you from being able to abridge, encroach upon, or trample upon the fundamental and inalienable God-given rights of the citizens and the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, we the people of these United States of America. In other words, it shows that we must be thankful that our founding fathers had the sagacity that they did, that they had the near absolute and infinite wisdom and foresight that they did, which gave the world its longest contiguous or uninterrupted running constitutional document in the entire course of human events or world history. And it also shows that we must reject the revisionist drivel from those historical revisionists who want to proclaim that Thanksgiving was merely a day of national genocide against the Indians, or their political correct or politically correct term of Native Americans. That must come to an end. We are Americans. Now, the tribes that are independent nations, they can celebrate whatever holiday they want. But for those of us who swear allegiance to the Constitution, which is the only thing that we, in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, are called to swear allegiance to, we must begin to hold people accountable for their words, for their deeds, and their actions. And that means that these little revisionists, these little cultural Marxists that want to eradicate the true history of the United States and who want to obliterate the holiday by trying to proclaim that it is some sort of nonsensical cultural appropriation or cultural genocide, need to be held accountable. Why is it that they can exert such influence that they'll attack it as they have attacked Columbus Day, as they have attacked the National Day of Prayer, as they have attacked, including the lines "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, or "in God we trust" on our coinage and money? These people are trying to create what is known as a tyranny of a minority, and that is not allowed in a federalist, representative republic like that of these United States of America. And it's the same thing with those who are trying to say that we should do away with the Electoral College. No, we shouldn't. We really shouldn't. And with respect to that recent incident that occurred with the cast of Hamilton on Broadway, basically lecturing Vice President-elect Mike Pence, that is absurd. Look, they're free to say it. We're not going to besmirch them for their fundamental and inalienable God-given right of freedom of expression. But what happened to civil discourse? What happened to allowing people to enjoy entertainment without it being intermingled with politics? Not everything has to be politics. And yes, the topic was Hamilton. But Hamilton was the largest promoter of the Electoral College. Hamilton wanted to go so far as to create an oligarchy in the United States. He wanted a national funded brewery paid for by taxpayers. He was the one that led the movement against the Whiskey Rebellion that was over taxation without representation. He had almost, literally, totally turned his back on the very natural law tenets that we had spent that long drawn-out bloody affair known as the American War of Independence fighting to secure and achieve for not only that generation, but for all of posterity. And it was that, along with his desire for there to be a national bank, that eventually led him into the duel with Thomas Jefferson's Vice President hopeful Aaron Burr. So the cast, saying that it would have to be an all-inclusive, diverse system in which everyone is represented, would find that that's not the way Alexander Hamilton approached it. So they can say whatever they want, but they ought to back it up with history. They ought to realize that the true history of the United States of America has shown that one of the most patriotic things that Alexander Hamilton ever did was to have the good foresight and fortune to lose a duel. Because deep down, he would have advocated, perhaps not to the great extent that we see it gripping the hearts, souls, and minds of the country today, but this sort of departure and divorcement from the natural law tenets and the clear and concise language contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution. He was a Federalist. And many of the Federalists that were hardliners, or more of the hardline, wanted full dominion of government over the people. John Adams, with the Alien and Sedition Act that was very much so supported by Hamilton, although Hamilton had personal disliking, or had a personal disliking to our second president, and therefore did everything in his power to ensure that he would not win re-election in 1800. So we see they pushed that, and it was a departure from all that we did give Thanksgiving for, and it was Jefferson in 1800 who had helped return it to what it needed to be. And so we are approaching a moment in our nation's history where we can sit back and say that the transfer of power is being handed over peacefully, or at least it's being attempted to, and that irrespective of whether we are pleased with the results of the presidential election cycle, we can at least say in good conscience that we have achieved yet another chapter in our history where our founding fathers' design, at least for the transfer of power, is going forth as it has for the past almost 2.5 centuries. And that's amazing. That's amazing because so many nations, for the great breadth of world history, were not capable of having the peaceful transfer of power. And it resulted in violence. But we here in the United States are so blessed that that is not the type of system we have, and that we are a free and egalitarian people, that we are protected by the greatest birthright and inheritance of any people on God's earth. So how do we properly do that? Well, we do it by spending time with our family. We do it by taking a moment to step back and to reflect upon the true nature of our government and the true meaning of the Thanksgiving holiday. And when we do that, it gives us the introspection to see just how fortunate we are. And it will replenish the natural national spirit of the United States. Now, I don't mean that in the nationalism like the alleged alt-right do. I mean that by going back to the only thing that does define us as a nation and as a people. The supreme law of the land, which pursuant to Article 6, Clause 2, the Supremacy Clause, is none other than the United States Constitution itself. That is such a beautiful thing. That is such a long-lasting attribute of who we are, both as a nation and as a people, that we oftentimes take it for granted. And I think that one of the lingering purposes of the Thanksgiving holiday is so that we don't take it for granted, so that we take the time to actually reflect upon the great bountiful gifts we have received. And let's face it, folks, we here in the United States of America are the beneficiaries of some very wonderful and bountiful gifts. And we must renew our efforts to advocate for them, to promote them, and to protect the Constitution, so that the up-and-coming generations, and indeed those generations which have yet to be born, can continue to freely exercise their fundamental and inalienable God-given rights without fear of governmental ramifications or repercussions. That is our duty, obligation, but above all responsibility, in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours. Now, with that said, it is time for us to begin our descent. I'm going to go ahead and send the flight attendant back with a turkey drumstick for you, as well as that last round of alcohol. As always, folks, I'm your captain, Randy Wright, and I want to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. Should you have any questions, comments, concerns, or even topics that you would like or wish for us to discuss here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, I invite you to leave them either here in the comment section at YouTube, or on our Google Plus page, or our Facebook page, or you can leave it to us on Twitter with the Twitter handle at Radio Aviation EX. One more time, folks, that's at Radio Aviation EX, and there you will find the departure board that lists my personal Twitter account, the personal Twitter account of my first officer, Jeremy Grapenton, our Blogspot page, where I've fallen behind a little bit again, where what I'm doing is putting up links to the video as well as the audio-only version of our state-of-the-art radio program so that you can listen to it at your own leisure and in the format you so desire. And then there is the Cafe Press account. As this is the holiday season beginning, folks, there are all sorts of trinkets and goodies that'll make fantastic gifts, such as a hat with the original Radio Aviation Excellence logo on it, or a laptop sleeve or phone protector, and it also has our first class passenger logo and the two newest Uplifting America logos. Folks, there are so many things there at reasonable prices. You just can't go wrong. Take a gander of that and get some wonderful stocking stuffers for your families and loved ones, and make this a very joyous occasion. Once again, thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. We will see you again.